You hear that? That's the sound of history breaking. The words cut through the war room like a blade. The laser plasma displays flickered erratically, overloaded by a relentless feed of disaster. Valan Arik barely glanced at the man who spoke, Commander Drelkin, one of the few men in the room who still believed Earth had a chance. The feed showed cities drowning in firelight, streets buckling under the weight of collapsing towers, planetary defense stations burning in eerie silence. In orbit, Earth's defunct battle platforms hung like museum pieces, monuments of a forgotten war doctrine, now pulverized into drifting debris. Zur-An didn't invade, Drelkin continued, voice edged with contempt. He walked in, like he was collecting an old debt. Valan Arik exhaled slowly, staring at the fractured embers of diplomacy. He was a historian, not a soldier. For 2,000 years, war had been nothing but an entry in the archives, a relic of the barbaric past. Yet here they were. The war room stank of sweat and burnt circuitry, the heat from overloaded conduits making the air thick. Officers barked half-formed plans over one another, panic boiling over in desperate murmurs. The Galactic Federation's response? A single detached transmission. Humanity is expected to negotiate. The Federation will not intervene. Expected to negotiate? Valan muttered, his voice nearly lost in the chaos. He turned to the primary heads-up display, where Zur-An's warships loomed against the planet's stratosphere, black and angular, like a surgeon's blade held against flesh. Then a new transmission flickered onto the display, the Predator's voice coiling through the speakers like a tightening noose. Earth, you have mistaken mercy for weakness. You have until sunrise to surrender. Sunrise. 6 hours. The room fell silent, as if the collective realization had choked out the breath from every man present. Drelkin's lip curled. He wants us to think we're already dead. Valan didn't look away from the display, watching the unblinking eyes of the enemy fleet staring back. Then let's remind him. The dead can still teach the living fear. Minutes later, Valan stood inside Vault 23, the subterranean library buried beneath Geneva's ruins. Here the air was damp and metallic, thick with the weight of memory. The low flicker of artificial lighting cast shadows across shelves of sealed documents, forgotten battle footage, and outdated tactical modules. Every war humanity had fought, every doctrine erased from public consciousness in the name of peace. A voice crackled to life from the vault's embedded speakers. Authorization confirmed. Project Revenant accessed. The room awoke. Laser plasma projections ignited, illuminating forgotten history in cold, clinical light. The first image wasn't a fleet or a battle. It was a name. Commander Saul Drennick. Valan's throat tightened. A name whispered in cautionary tales. A relic from a time when humanity fought wars no one wanted to remember. Another projection flickered into focus. Classified footage from the last interstellar war. A silent battlefield, strewn with shattered alien warships. Not burning, not wrecked, but severed with surgical brutality. Fleet formations dissected with terrifying calculation. Enemies lured into kill boxes. Their retreats cut off before they even began. War, as humanity had once known it, was not about brutality. It was about inevitability. And now Valan knew the truth. We never lost our weapons. We locked them away. And we never forgot how to use them. His gaze dropped to the bottom of the projection, the final note attached to Project Revenant. In the event of planetary invasion, the contingency is clear. Wake the last of us. 20 minutes later, a secured transmission raced across what remained of Earth's classified networks. Beneath the sands of the Mojave, in the hardened silos of Facility Theta, something stirred. Buried under kilometers of reinforced concrete, a cryostasis vault hummed to life. Steel doors, welded shut for 2 millennia, screamed against their own hinges. The cold hiss of decompression was followed by a sound no living human had heard in 2,000 years. A soldier's first breath in an era that had forsaken them. A man stepped forward, his presence like a knife in the air, scarred hands clenched into fists. eyes, older than the wars that had been forgotten, opened to a world unrecognizable. The room's automated systems scanned him. A synthetic voice confirmed the impossible. Commander Rauken, reinstated. He exhaled once, staring at the activation orders flashing across the heads-up display, his lips pulled into a wry, mirthless smirk. "So," he muttered, voice raw with disuse, "they finally remembered we existed." Back in the war room, the last of Earth's military strategists gathered, some standing, others collapsed into chairs, the weight of the moment crushing them. Commander Drelkon studied the incoming fleet formations, a slow grin creeping across his face. Zuran's playing textbook conquest. He expects terror to do half the job for him. Valen nodded, eyes locked on the strategic maps. He wants compliance, not combat. Drelkon's grin widened, humorless and sharp. Then it's time we start giving him things he doesn't want. Valen turned to the display, now showing incoming enemy deployment zones, overlaid with historical battle data from the last human war. His voice was steady. Activate every buried installation, every encrypted satellite, every classified archive. The officers exchanged glances. The old world was waking up. Drelkon's grin faded as the reality set in. "Are you sure about this?" Valen didn't blink. War was at their doorstep. There was no room for uncertainty. "This isn't about winning. It's about making them regret thinking we couldn't." The last of Earth's forgotten war machine was about to rise from its grave. The war room stank of burnt circuits and sweat, the stale air weighed down by the heavy musk of desperation. Every display flickered with grim confirmations, Zuran's forces tightening their grip on the planet, territories falling without a single human shot fired. The Federation's silence rang louder than the klaxons. Valen Arik stood motionless, his gaze locked on the rippled topography of old battlefields, remnants of wars humanity had buried under treaties and time. His fingers traced over a specific set of coordinates, glowing on the heads-up display, deep beneath the Mojave Desert. Facility Theta, the last place the old world whispered before being sealed away. Drelkon leaned closer, his breath hot with disbelief. "This isn't diplomacy anymore." He gestured toward the display, eyes narrowed. "We're playing a game everyone but us remembers how to win." Valen didn't respond. His mind was already elsewhere, in a place where the old rules had never died. "Get me transport," he said finally. "We're opening the tomb." The entrance to Facility Theta was a jagged scar in the desert, the earth split open like a wound resisting closure. Sandstorms had tried to erase it, but beneath the shifting dunes, the steel remained. Valen stepped forward, his boots grinding against the cracked ground. The reinforced doors loomed like the mouth of a dead god, ancient warning sigils barely visible beneath the corrosion. Drelkon muttered under his breath, "You ever think maybe some doors should stay closed?" Valen exhaled. They should have, but peace had made that choice for them. The control panel was a relic of another age, its surface marred by old impacts. He wiped the dust away, revealing a security lock that hadn't been touched in centuries. A single code. That's all it took. The ground shuddered as magnetic locks disengaged, pistons groaning from centuries of disuse. Then, with a final, agonizing lurch, the doors parted. Air, sealed for 2,000 years, exhaled out like the breath of a sleeping giant. A wave of cold washed over them, carrying the scent of something old and undisturbed. Not decay, sterile, preserved time. The facility stretched downward, a cathedral of steel and shadows. Flickering emergency lights cast erratic pulses along the walls, illuminating fragments of history encased in frost and silence. At the heart of the chamber stood the cryostasis vaults, rows upon rows of forgotten warriors, their faces locked in the suspended serenity of those who had been forced to wait. A console flickered to life as Valen stepped forward. A synthetic voice, eerily calm, filled the chamber. Authorization confirmed. Project Revenant accessed. A hiss of depressurization. Then the first coffin of steel and glass cracked open. The figure within remained still for a moment, as if time itself hesitated to claim him. Then, a ragged inhale. A man stepping from the past into a world he no longer recognized. Commander Rauken's first breath sounded more like a growl. His movements were sharp, almost too quick, muscles coiled like a blade waiting for purpose. His eyes cut through the dim light, a piercing shade of storm-washed steel. Silence. Then, in a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid things, he spoke. "How long?" Valen met his gaze. 2,000 years. Rauken's expression didn't shift, but something flickered in the depths of his stare. A slow, measured exhale. He glanced around, taking in the unfamiliar world where time had moved. But he had not. "And the war?" Valen's throat tightened. "It's back." Rauken flexed his fingers, testing the resistance of muscles left untouched for centuries. Then, with the faintest tilt of his head, "Figures." The other stasis pods rumbled as more warriors stirred, old ghosts awakening to a future built atop their sacrifices. The room filled with the sounds of shuddering exhales, boots scraping against metal, the whisper of movement as history shook off its chains. Rauken watched them rise, his gaze unreadable. Then to Valen, "You wouldn't be here if the world didn't need monsters again." Valen swallowed. "Number we wouldn't." Silence stretched between them, thick with the unspoken weight of a past no longer buried. Finally, Rauken exhaled, a sound halfway between resignation and amusement. "Well," he said, rolling his shoulders, "if the galaxies come to kill us again, we should at least be awake for it." The displays flooded with forgotten data, files that had been deemed too dangerous for a world that chose peace. Battle strategies resurrected, doctrines unarchived, weapons logs decrypted. Drelkin watched it unfold, a low whistle escaping through his teeth. "Feels like we just broke a pact with something bigger than the Federation." Valen barely heard him. His gaze was locked on the deployment readouts now filling the screens. Buried defense grids, long thought dismantled, reactivated. Old warships, once consigned to history, awakening in dry docks. Strategic zones marked as lost, suddenly viable again. War hadn't been erased. It had been sleeping. A new transmission appeared, encrypted. A voice, old and tempered, filled the war room for the first time in 2 millennia. "This is Commander Rauken. I want a full status report. And someone tell me where the hell the enemy is." Drelkan let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a chuckle. "I think we just stopped losing." Valen didn't smile. His fingers hovered over the interface, taking in the awakening of the old world. This wasn't a victory. This was a warning. For the first time since the war began, the enemy didn't know what they were about to face. The war room pulsed with energy. Laser plasma displays bled red with combat data, the war map shifting like a wounded beast, Earth's remaining territories flickering in and out of existence as cities fell to Torvani forces. Across the room, the newly awakened war veterans studied the data in silence, expressions carved from stone. Commander Rauken stood at the center, his presence sharp as a drawn blade. He had spent the last 6 hours learning a world that had forgotten men like him, a galaxy that thought war was extinct. He let the silence linger, watching the younger officers flinch beneath the weight of the moment. Then, in a voice like breaking steel, he said, "They think we're weak." No one responded. He exhaled, slow and measured, then gestured at the battle map. "They think peace is an armor we've forgotten how to take off. They believe we are soft. Diplomats playing at survival." He leaned forward, fingers pressing into the cold steel of the table. "Let's show them what happens when a peaceful species stops pretending." Valen Arik folded his arms. "We don't have firepower." Rauken's eyes flicked toward him. "Number. But we have something worse." Earth's first move was not a battle. It was a whisper. High-orbit satellites flickered to life, long dormant systems purging dust from their circuits. Encrypted signals laced through the black, stretching invisible hands into the Torvani command structure, unraveling data threads one by one. The first disruptions were small, a destroyed patrol drone here, a misplaced supply route there, errors that seemed coincidental. Then came the miscommunications. Torvani officers received conflicting orders. Drop coordinates led to barren wastelands. Naval formation shifted inexplicably, leaving transport convoys unguarded in enemy-controlled space. And then, the first true disaster struck. A Torvani forward command base, fortified, shielded, a bastion of invasion efforts, erupted in flames, not from an attack, from within. On board the Torvani flagship, the Black Maw, High Warlord Zuran's claws dug into the arms of his command throne. His eyes flickered, taking in the heads-up display projected before him. Distorted maps, fractured communication lines, missing supply shipments. Every report brought the same conclusion. Nothing was making sense. A junior officer stood stiff before him, throat tight with fear. High Warlord, our forces are experiencing unexplained complications. Zuran's voice was glacial. Complications? The officer swallowed. There are reports of sabotage, units being rerouted incorrectly, infiltrators we cannot identify. Zuran turned slowly, fixing the officer with an unreadable gaze. Then quietly he asked, "What color was the sky on your homeworld this morning?" The officer blinked. "My homeworld?" The blade was in his throat before the sentence finished. The others in the command chamber watched without flinching as Zuran cleaned his knife against the dead officer's uniform. "Fear spreads faster than fire," he murmured. "If they think the enemy walks among them, they will become their own executioners." Valen Arik crouched in the ruins of old Anchorage, his breath shallow as he watched Torvani soldiers turn on each other. It had started with a whisper, a planted transmission, a falsified assassination order, a few well-placed bodies, killed in ways only Torvani weapons could achieve. Now paranoia burned hotter than any plasma round. A commanding officer barked at his squad, ordering them to verify their chain of command. One of them hesitated, just a second too long. The first shot came from inside their own ranks, then the rest followed. Valen turned his head slightly as Rauken crouched beside him. The older soldier watched the carnage unfold with the cold detachment of a man who had seen it before. "They'll burn themselves down to the bones if we keep pushing them," Valen murmured. Rauken's voice was quiet, but sharp as cut glass. "Then we push harder." The real blow came an hour later. Deep within the Torvani war network, something cracked. A virus, ancient in design, handcrafted from war doctrines long outlawed, spread like a silent plague. Entire battalions lost access to their encrypted files. Enemy fleet movements were broadcasted onto civilian networks. A false message, written in Zuran's own command signature, ordered 3 warships to abandon their stations. When the real command center tried to override it, they found themselves locked out. Panic spread through the Torvani ranks like a contagion. Then, for the first time, the humans sent a transmission. Not a plea, not a surrender, a single 7-word message. "You are fighting the wrong kind of war." On board the Black Maw, Zuran watched his war machine stall, limbs severed one by one. This wasn't a battle of brute force. This was something surgical, insidious, designed to unravel him from the inside. His clawed fingers tapped against the armrest. "They're not fighting back," he said at last. His officers exchanged uneasy glances. "My lord?" Zuran's gaze burned like a dying star. "They are not resisting. They are dismantling." Back on Earth, the war room was deathly silent, everyone watching as the Torvani war machine lurched toward collapse. Drelkon's expression was almost unreadable. "This is working." Rauken didn't look away from the displays, his voice a low murmur. "For now." Valen exhaled. "Zuran isn't a fool. He's going to look for the source of the disruption." Rauken finally turned toward him. "Then let's give him one." Valen frowned. "You want to bait him?" Rauken's smile was razor sharp. "We've spent enough time being the ghosts in his shadow. It's time to remind him we have teeth." Deep in the unmapped territories of Earth, an old warship powered up for the first time in 2,000 years. The Vanguard, a vessel once feared, long thought decommissioned, emerged from its grave. Its engines roared as it ascended through the stratosphere, cutting through the darkness like a blade unsheathed. A single encrypted message flashed across the human war network. Phase 2. Begin. The Vanguard tore through the stratosphere, a relic wrenched from the graveyard of history, its dark hull catching the light of a world that no longer remembered its name. It wasn't just a warship. It was a testament to a time when humanity had not only fought wars, but had engineered them into something far more terrifying. Commander Rauken stood on the command deck, the weight of centuries pressing against his shoulders. His heads-up display flickered with tactical overlays, old schematics meshing with real-time battlefield intelligence. He watched as the Torvani fleet adjusted its formations, recalibrating to the new threat. "They took the bait," Valen muttered from his station, eyes locked on the incoming combat trajectories. Rauken's fingers curled around the rail. "Of course they did." His gaze was cold, calculating. "They think we're desperate." Drelkan stood near the weapons console, shaking his head slightly. "A single warship against an armada? That's what they see." Rauken exhaled sharply. "They don't understand what they're looking at." The Vanguard was not a warship built for survival. It was built for endings. Above Earth, Torvani capital ships shifted into an interception formation, their sleek hulls cutting through the darkness like predatory beasts circling wounded prey. The Black Maw, Zuran's flagship, hovered at the center of the formation, its massive silhouette swallowing the stars behind it. Inside the Torvani command bridge, the warlord sat with his claws laced together, his expression unreadable. A heads-up display flickered to life, casting a blood-red glow across his face. His officers had assembled, their spines rigid with anticipation. "Report," Zuran ordered. One of his tactical officers stepped forward. "The human vessel is ancient but operational. Its energy signatures suggest reactivated combat systems." Zuran's eyes narrowed. "One ship?" Another officer hesitated before speaking. "Yes, High Warlord." Zuran's gaze swept over them like a blade. "Then why are you speaking to me?" The officer flinched. "Because, my lord, the ship's registry matches one from the last war." A slow silence settled over the command deck. Zuran's jaw tightened. The last war, the one conflict no species ever discussed. The war that had left humanity untouched not because of mercy, but because something had gone horribly wrong for the enemy. He rose from his throne, stepping forward. "What is its designation?" The officer swallowed. "Vanguard." The name landed like a curse. Zuran's eyes flickered with something sharp, something dangerously close to recognition. Then, quietly, "Destroy it." The Vanguard accelerated toward the Torvani fleet, its motion a calculated display of defiance. Rauken studied the tactical interface, watching the enemy fleet reorganize, adjusting trajectories. He could almost hear their thoughts. They believed it was a desperate last-stand maneuver. They thought the ship's age meant vulnerability. They assumed they were about to crush the final resistance of a dying species. "They still think this is about strength," Rauken muttered, almost amused. Valen turned toward him. "Isn't it?" Rauken's lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. "It's about control." With a single motion, he activated the Vanguard's primary subroutines. The Torvani fleet moved in for the kill, warships deploying heavy plasma arrays, targeting systems locking onto the human vessel. And then, their systems went dark. One by one, their ships veered off course, command signals severed, navigation systems flooding with contradictions. Entire weapons arrays misfired, their own fleets caught in the crossfire. Panic erupted across their channels. Zuran's claws dug into the armrest of his command throne as his warships, his finely tuned instruments of destruction, turned against one another in a storm of confusion and error. "What? In the name of—" Then the true horror set in. The Vanguard wasn't attacking. It was watching, waiting. Every movement, every shift in strategy, every Torvani reaction was being recorded, analyzed, adjusted. The ship wasn't engaging them. It was dissecting them. Zuran's snarl rattled the air. "Cut through the interference! Find the source!" His officers scrambled, their heads-up displays flooded with collapsing firewalls and severed transmission lines. Zuran's eyes burned as he whispered, "They've been studying us." And then, for the first time since the war began, Zuran felt something dangerous coiling in his gut. A cold, gnawing realization. He had not walked into a battle. He had walked into a lesson, and the humans were teaching him what war really looked like. Back on the Vanguard, Raukan watched the Torvani fleet fracture, their lines breaking apart without a single direct shot fired. Drelkan exhaled, watching the chaos unfold. They don't know where the attack is coming from. Valen, standing beside him, barely breathed. Because there isn't one. Raukan nodded. There never was. They weren't using firepower. They were using doubt. Zuran's strength isn't his fleet, Raukan said quietly. It's his control over it. His fingers tapped the interface, watching as the Torvani officers turned on each other, accusing one another of sabotage, hesitating in the face of unseen threats. Valen turned toward him, something unreadable in his gaze. And what happens when he realizes the only battle happening here is inside his own ships? Raukan's expression darkened. He'll try to force order back into chaos. Drelkan glanced at the tactical map. And when he does? Raukan's voice was quiet, steady, absolute. We make sure his next move is his last. Inside the Black Maw, Zuran's calm shattered as he barked orders to reconsolidate his fleet, his voice ablaze against the growing storm of paranoia. But then, one of his own ships locked weapons onto his flagship. Zuran froze. The bridge was silent, filled only with the sound of static-filled orders, each Torvani captain convinced they had been infiltrated, each one seeing threats in every shadow. Then, a transmission flickered onto Zuran's heads-up display. Not a plea, not a surrender, a whisper. Checkmate. The transmission cut, and then his own fleet turned its guns toward him. The Black Maw convulsed under its own firepower. Torvani ships, once a synchronized force, were now a web of confusion, turning their weapons on allies, chasing ghosts that weren't there. The sound of emergency klaxons screeched through the corridors of the warlord's flagship. Zuran stood in the center of the bridge, shoulders rigid, claws digging into the armrest of his command throne. The display screens around him blinked erratically, showing corrupted readouts, friendlies marked as hostiles, battle orders that had never been given. His fleet wasn't just under attack. It was being rewired, dissected, turned into a weapon against itself. This isn't sabotage, he muttered, voice low, seething. His gaze flicked across the heads-up display, searching for something, anything, that would make sense. One of his officers hesitated. High Warlord? Zuran turned his head slowly. His second-in-command stiffened but continued. We... A pause, deep and careful, as if the next words would set the ship ablaze. We no longer control our own targeting systems. Zuran's expression didn't change, but something beneath the surface fractured. For the first time in his long, blood-stained reign, he did not understand the battlefield. Light years below, in the depths of Earth's last war room, Valen Arik watched the chaos unfold. His hands rested on the console, tension coiling through his spine as encrypted data scrolled in waves across the laser plasma displays. He could feel the shift. The war wasn't ending. It was entering a phase humanity had spent 2,000 years perfecting. Drelkan exhaled beside him, eyes tracking the real-time fleet breakdown. If we push now, we could gut them. Valen didn't move. Not yet. Drelkan's head turned slightly. You're stalling. Valen's fingers tapped absently against the metal. I'm waiting. Raukan stepped forward, gaze locked on the projected fleet movements, his expression void of doubt. Zuran is still a warlord, he said, voice like distant thunder. Corner him too early and he'll fight like one. He turned toward Valen. But if we wait long enough... Valen nodded. He'll start thinking like a man losing his empire. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to break him. Zuran's mind burned through possible counter-strategies, tearing through scenarios at a relentless pace. Every move he made, Every order he gave unraveled before it could take shape. He barked a command. "Disable all autonomous systems, manual control only." His officers scrambled, hands flying across control surfaces, as they attempted to sever the corruption choking their fleet. But it was too late. The Vanguard, that ancient relic of war that should have been nothing more than a ghost of another age, was no longer just attacking. It was rewriting the war itself. The Torvani fleet sought escape, desperate to re-establish formations, to claw back some semblance of control. But as they moved, space itself turned against them. Gravity wells activated. Unmarked orbital platforms, buried deep within Earth's forgotten battle zones, ignited, their long-dormant thrusters pushing unseen forces into play. The Torvani ships lurched as their trajectories warped, their own momentum twisting against them. They weren't being pinned down by firepower. They were being pinned down by physics itself. Zuran's blood ran cold. This was not random chaos. This was calculated collapse. He turned to his comms officer. "Emergency transmission. Open frequency." A pause. Then, "Hi, Warlord." "No one is responding." Zuran's voice sliced through the bridge. "What?" The officer swallowed, frantically adjusting the controls. I don't know how, but our signals aren't reaching the fleet." Zuran exhaled, slow and sharp. He turned his head, eyes burning into the main heads-up display, watching the unthinkable unfold. One by one, his ships were being sectioned off, herded like cattle into kill zones they hadn't even realized existed. Humanity wasn't just winning the battle. They had already written its ending. On the Vanguard, Raukan watched the final pieces fall into place. Drelkan folded his arms. Zuran's next move is surrender or suicide. Valen's jaw tensed. If he chooses surrender, it's a trick. Raukan didn't blink. Then let's make sure he doesn't have a choice. He activated the final sequence. Across the battlefield, the last dormant human installations came to life. Weapons platforms, ones the galaxy assumed had been dismantled in peacetime, primed for execution. Not a single one of them fired. Instead, they broadcasted. Encrypted, high-frequency pulses flooded the Torvani fleet, reprogramming their core navigational data, twisting their own warships into submission. Zuran's remaining forces watched in helpless silence as their own vessels powered down, their control systems overridden, their warships now adrift in the void, with nowhere to go. A single message blinked across every remaining Torvani command screen. "This war is over. You just haven't accepted it yet." Zuran inhaled, slow and deep. His claws flexed once, then, softly, "Not yet." He stood, turning away from his officers. He wasn't going to die here. Inside the Vanguard's war room, an alert flashed red across the heads-up display. Valen's stomach twisted. "Zuran's escaping." Drelkan's hands clenched. "Where?" Raukan didn't move, watching the flight path unfold on the screen. "To a system he thinks we won't follow," he murmured. Valen's throat tightened as he stared at the screen. Zuran wasn't running. He was regrouping. And the war wasn't over. Zuran's escape vector burned through the battlefield, his personal warship breaking past the collapsing remains of his fleet, a silver dagger streaking toward the void, slicing through the wreckage of his own failure. The Vanguard's war room was silent, but it was not the silence of victory, it was the silence of unfinished business. Valen Arek's gaze tracked the flight path on the heads-up display, the shifting data streams painting a clear picture. Zuran wasn't retreating. He was slipping into a position to retaliate. "He's running," Drelkan muttered, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. Raukan barely glanced at him. "No," he said, "he's shedding weight. Abandoning the parts of his fleet that are useless to him." His jaw tightened slightly. A warlord doesn't run unless he sees a way to win from the other side. Valen exhaled, fingers tapping against the control panel. "Then we follow." Zuran's dreadnought cut through the void, piercing into the uncharted regions beyond the battlefield. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of smoldering circuitry, the scent of failure and blood hanging between the deck plating. His remaining officers stood stiff around the war table, eyes averted, knowing their warlord was teetering on the knife edge between fury and calculated response. Zuran's claws drummed against the metal of his gauntlet, his expression unreadable. His fleet had fallen apart beneath his hands, his command structure severed, his ships turned against him. And yet he was alive. That meant the war was not over. A lone officer, braver or stupider than the rest, stepped forward. "High Warlord, our communications array is crippled. We are cut off from the remaining Dominion fleets." Zuran's gaze flicked toward him, cold and unwavering. "Do you think I do not know that?" The officer swallowed hard. "What are your orders?" Zuran's eyes burned as he turned back to the war table. "Summon the Forgotten." The room tensed. Another officer's voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. "High Warlord, they were exiled." Zuran's expression remained unreadable. "So was I." Back aboard the Vanguard, Rauken stood over the tactical interface, watching the distant shadow of Zuran's dreadnought as it slipped toward an unnamed sector. Drelkun frowned at the readings. Why is he headed there? There's nothing but cold rock and dead systems in that sector. Rauken's fingers flexed slightly against the table's edge. "Not dead. Dormant." Valen's voice was quieter, but no less sharp. "He's calling something the Federation didn't wipe out when they ended the last war." Drelkun's frown deepened. "Something worse?" Rauken's gaze flicked toward him, the corner of his mouth barely twitching. If it wasn't worse, they wouldn't have buried it. Zuran's dreadnought descended into the orbit of a barren world, its surface scarred by ancient battles, entire continents reduced to obsidian graveyards. The ship's landing thrusters ignited, a storm of dust and fire blooming beneath its bulk. Inside, Zuran strode toward the deepest levels of the ship, where security systems had long since rusted into forgotten sentinels. He entered the chamber where no living Torvani had stepped for centuries. The containment vault loomed ahead, its doors marked in the language of an empire that had once been whole. The words etched into the steel translated to only one thing: "Do not wake them." Zuran pressed his palm against the scanner. Metal groaned as locks disengaged, releasing the weight of history into the present. The doors split open and the room inside exhaled a breath that had been held for too long. They stood there, the forgotten. Torvani warriors, once the apex of the Dominion's strength, genetically honed into something beyond soldiers. They had been deemed too dangerous, too unstable, too willing to break the very galaxy they sought to conquer. So they had been locked away. Zuran stepped forward, his voice like the echo of war itself. "You were promised a battle worthy of your existence." His eyes burned. "It is here." The leader of the Forgotten opened his eyes, and for the first time in 2,000 years, war was reborn. Back in the war room, Valen watched the shifting fleet formations tracking Zuran's movements. The data streams told a story, but it was one they had not expected. "He's not regrouping," Drelkun muttered, leaning forward, eyes scanning the data. "He's rearming." Rauken's jaw tightened. "He called something he thinks can turn this war around." Valen exhaled. "Then we don't give him the time to use it." Rauken's gaze flicked toward him, an approving glint in his eye. "What are you suggesting?" Valen's fingers danced across the laser plasma interface, marking key points on the war map. "We don't let him recover. We push into his last stronghold before he can deploy whatever he's found." Drelkun crossed his arms. "That means engaging before we have full control of the battlefield." Valen's voice was steady. "It means making sure this war never gets a second phase." Rauken's lips curled slightly. "Then let's remind him what happens when humanity fights on its own terms." Deep within the abandoned Torvani fortress, the Forgotten warriors stepped forward, their forms shifting under the dim light, the air vibrating with their unnatural presence. Zuran turned toward them, the last weapon of the Dominion, hidden away until the galaxy forgot its terror. One of the warriors met his gaze. "We will burn their world to the bone." Zuran's lips curled. "Yes, but first, we will break them." Far above, aboard the Vanguard, The alert systems flared red, new intelligence pouring in. Valen, Rauken, and Drelkan stared at the transmission, their expressions dark. Zuran's dreadnought tore through the silence, its massive hull reflecting the distant glows of dying stars. The warlord stood motionless on his bridge, the weight of his next move settling into his bones. The Torvani fleet had suffered catastrophic losses. His once mighty war machine had been dissected piece by piece by an enemy that refused to fight by any known rules. But Zuran wasn't done. Not yet. He had summoned the Forgotten, and they had answered. Now, he would unleash them. Status on the fleet? His voice was sharp, slicing through the tension on his bridge. One of his officers straightened, his movements clipped with nervous energy. The remaining warships have consolidated at the outer ring of the Arconis Rift. They await your command. Zuran's eyes flickered toward the heads-up display, scanning his dwindling forces. Too many ships lost, too many warlords dead. And the humans? They were still out there, watching, waiting. He exhaled slowly. Send the Forgotten to the front lines. They will take the fight to the humans. His second-in-command hesitated. Zuran's eyes darkened. Did you not hear me? The officer stiffened, jaw tight. High Warlord, the Forgotten. They have already deployed. Zuran's brow furrowed. Without orders? A cold silence stretched across the bridge. Then another officer turned, his voice quieter. They're not responding to commands. Zuran's claws curled against the metal rail. Explain. The officer's throat bobbed. They're moving toward the human fleet. But not in formation. They're scattering. Zuran's mind sharpened, tearing through possibilities. Then it hit him. The Forgotten weren't hunting the humans. They were running. Back on the vanguard, Rauken watched the battlefield unfold with brutal clarity. The Forgotten had entered the fight, monstrous warriors of old, bred for slaughter. But something was wrong. They weren't charging toward human battle lines. They were fracturing, splitting into irregular movements, breaking apart like prey sensing a predator in the dark. Drelkan's brows furrowed. What the hell are they doing? Valen was already ahead of him, his gaze locked onto the laser plasma displays mapping the war zone. Pattern recognition algorithms were running alongside ancient tactical archives. And then, a chilling realization. They see something, Valen murmured. Drelkan glanced at him. What? Valen's voice was quiet. They see us. Not the warships, not the fleet formations, the ghosts, the war machines humanity had buried, the weapons locked away in the last war. The Forgotten, bred for battle, could sense death before it arrived. And now, for the first time, they were afraid. Zuran's fists clenched as his most lethal force crumbled without a fight. High Warlord! One of his officers turned toward him, voice tight with unease. The humans, they haven't fired a single shot. Zuran's breath slowed. His fleet was intact. His warriors still lived. And yet, he was losing. His mind raced, tracking every engagement, every lost battle, every moment where control had slipped from his grasp. Then it struck him. The war had never been about the battles. It had been about dismantling his empire before he even realized it was happening. His fleet had been turned against itself. His warriors had been fed fear before the fight even began. His empire had been bled dry in whispers and shadows, and now his last weapon was breaking before he even unleashed it. On the vanguard, Rauken exhaled slowly. The Forgotten were routed, the last remnants of Zuran's power fraying at the seams. Valen's fingers hovered over the controls. Drelkan glanced at him. So, what now? Rauken's gaze didn't waver. We end this. Valen tapped a sequence into the interface, sending a single transmission to the human fleet. All units, advance. Across the Arconis Rift, human warships emerged from the shadows, cutting through the battlefield like wolves descending upon a wounded beast. The Torvani fleet stood paralyzed, unable to coordinate, unable to rally. This wasn't a battle. This was a reckoning. On board the Black Maw, Zuran watched his war machine collapse. His officers whispered behind him, fear creeping into their bones. He had nothing left to give them. No words, no orders, no promises. He had built his power on strength and control. And now, standing among the ashes of his own making, he realized he had neither. A new transmission flickered onto his display, a voice, human, cold, unshaken. You were never fighting a war. A pause. You were the demonstration. And then, through the battlefield, the final strike began. The Vanguard's weapons came online, their targeting systems locking onto the Black Maw. Valen turned toward Raukan. Do we take him alive? Raukan's stare was steady. No. Valen didn't ask why. He simply pressed the command. A single warhead fired from the Vanguard, slicing through the battlefield in silence. Zuran, standing on his bridge, closed his eyes. A final thought. Not of war, not of victory, but of what had been waiting in the dark all along. The Black Maw had been reduced to drifting ruin, its once imposing silhouette now a molten carcass sinking toward the gravity well of a dead star. Flames licked through the shattered remains, fragments of the once mighty flagship scattering into the dark, swallowed by the silence of a war already decided. Zuran was gone. The Torvani fleet, leaderless, broken, offered no final stand. Some ships powered down their weapons, surrendering in place. Others simply turned away, fleeing toward the unknown, carrying whispers of a war that had not been lost in battle, but in something far deeper. On the Vanguard, Raukan stood at the edge of the command deck, gaze fixed on the wreckage outside, arms crossed over his chest like a soldier still bracing for the next order. Valen exhaled, watching the last laser plasma display feed flicker, showing the disbanding Torvani remnants. It's over, Drelkan muttered, voice low, unreadable. Raukan didn't turn. No, he murmured, it's never over. Valen studied him for a long moment. Zuran is dead. The war is done. Raukan's eyes darkened. Then tell me, what do you think the rest of the galaxy just saw? Silence stretched between them, because they all knew the answer. This wasn't a war humanity had barely survived. It was a war humanity had orchestrated, maneuvered, dismantled, and crushed before the first real battle ever began. The galaxy had expected them to plead. Instead, humanity had taken war, stripped it bare, and reshaped it into something even warlords feared. Drelkan let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming against the console. Then what do we do now? Valen's voice was quiet, but firm. We remind them. Across the galactic network, humanity broadcasted a single transmission. No threats, no demands, just a simple truth. We were never rusted. We were waiting. The message rippled through the stars, reaching distant systems, military outposts, high councils that had long dismissed Earth as a relic of a forgotten era. They had called humanity diplomats, philosophers, artists. Now, they called them something else, something far more dangerous. In the polished chambers of the Federation High Council, the transmission played in silence, flickering against the massive laser plasma displays. The room was still, a cold tension hanging between the gathered leaders of the galaxy's most powerful nations. For 2,000 years, the Federation had tolerated humanity's seat at the table, allowed them to exist under the pretense of peace, under the careful fiction that Earth was no longer a military force. But now? Now they knew the truth. A cold breath escaped from one of the senior officials. We assumed their war machine had rusted. Another voice, shaken but sharper. It was never rusted. It was buried. A long silence. Then the High Chancellor leaned forward, clasping his hands together. His expression was unreadable. And now that it's awake? No one answered. Because they all knew the galaxy would never look at Earth the same way again. On the Vanguard, the silence of victory weighed heavier than the war itself. Drelkan let out a slow exhale, rubbing a hand over his face. So that's it. We've made our point. Rauken's gaze remained locked on the stars beyond the viewport, his face carved in steel. "No," he murmured. "Not yet." Valen turned toward him. "Then what's left?" Rauken's lips curled slightly, but there was no humor in it, only the weight of understanding. "They will come. The Federation, the Dominion remnants. Every species that had watched this war unfold and realized what had just been unleashed." Drelkan frowned. "We proved we could win. Who would be stupid enough to challenge us now?" Rauken finally turned, his expression unreadable. "Not everyone fights because they think they'll win." His voice was quiet. "Some fight because they're afraid not to." Silence. Valen looked back at the battlefield, at the shattered remnants of an empire that had once thought humanity unworthy of fear. He had been a historian, a scholar, a man who once believed war belonged to the past. But there was no past, only cycles. And humanity? Humanity had just started a new one. Across the ruins of the Dominion fleet, across every Federation Council chamber, across every intelligence network that had monitored Earth's war, a single realization took hold. They had never understood humanity at all. The species that had once been feared as warriors, that had chosen peace over conquest, had not lost their edge. They had simply waited for someone to be foolish enough to test them. Zur-An had tested them, and now he was gone. Valen turned back toward the bridge, his voice steady, final. "We don't make the next move." Drelkan glanced at him. "Then what do we do?" Valen's eyes didn't waver. "We wait." The Vanguard powered down its weapons, its engines shifting toward the cold void once more. No war cries, no celebration, just a single message left drifting through the stars. A warning, a promise. Humanity was never weak. It simply had no reason to be strong. The war was over, but the galaxy would never forget.